So I'm going to say a little bit about our research programme in general, just to give you some orientation, and then I'm going to talk about forced labour, a modern form of slavery in the UK. In 2009, JRF began a major research programme looking at modern-day slavery in the UK, and our intention really was to build a more robust evidence base about the prevalence of forced labour here, and then to identify the kinds of policy and practice changes we need to make if we're to eradicate slavery. The first phase of the programme is really just trying to improve that evidence base, to try and build much more knowledge around forced labour. We've got a number of projects that are exploring the scope of forced labour and also the experience of workers, and those are the ones I'm going to be talking about this evening. In the second phase, we're looking to identify good practice, and that's both in terms of supporting victims of forced labour, but also working with businesses who are interested in eradicating forced labour from their supply chains. To date, we've published a paper on forced labour in Northern Ireland and papers looking at the definition of forced labour, as well as the way in which immigration status can make people vulnerable to forced labour. Over the coming months, we're going to be publishing a number of reports, including some that I'm going to be talking quite a lot about tonight, that look at the experience of Chinese migrant workers and also of forced labourers in the food industry. And all of our reports are available to download from jrf.org.uk. I should say, for those of you that are social media whizzes, please do tweet tonight using the hashtag JRFSlavery. So this evening I'm going to draw a little on our research to date, both the published and the yet to be published work. And I'm going to try and give you an overview of forced labour in the UK and suggest some of the reasons why we're still fighting for the abolition of slavery so long after that battle should have been won. But first, I'd like to start with a story. Ignatius Sancho was born in 1729, either in Africa or on a slave ship, depending on whose version of the story you believe, Ignatius's own or his biographer. He was born a slave. He worked as a house slave for many years here in London before becoming a grocer, author, and friend of some of the greatest public figures of his day. In 1774, at the height of the transatlantic slave trade, Ignatius became the first black man to vote in a UK election. When he died, he was the first black person to ever have an obituary in the national press. So here's an extract from Ignatius's most blistering account of the slave trade and of British Empire. It's taken from a letter written to a friend in 1778 to Jack Wingrave, the son of his friend, the London bookbinder and bookseller. He said, "I'm sorry to observe that the practice of your country, which as a resident I love, and for its freedom and for the many blessings I enjoy in it, shall ever have my warmest wishes, prayers and blessings. I say it is with reluctance that I must observe your country's conduct has been uniformly wicked in the East and the West Indies, and even in Guinea. The grand object of English navigators, indeed all Christian navigators, is money, 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 for which I do not pretend to blame them. Commerce was meant by the goodness of the deity to diffuse the various goods of the earth into every part. Commerce attended with strict honesty and with religion for its companion would be a blessing to every shore it touched at." When we talk about the history of slavery and its abolition, we think of it as something that happened a long time ago, or something that at the very least is happening far away. For most of us, slavery is about other people and other times. But globally, right now, many millions of people are living their lives in contemporary forms of slavery. The child labourers working the cocoa farms of Côte d'Ivoire, the debt-bonded members of the Dalit castes in India. And slavery is also right here, in the farms and the factories of the UK, in the sweatshops, brothels and private houses of this great world city. So how is that possible? Slavery, forced labour, trafficking, all of these things are illegal in international law and in the domestic legislation of most of the countries where slavery exists. The idea that slavery is an immoral abuse of human dignity and human rights is not seriously contested anywhere. But if contemporary forms of slavery exist here and now, then despite this universal condemnation, we can assume that forms of slavery still exist everywhere. This evening, I'll share some findings from our research on forced labour in the UK. Wherever possible, I'll be using the words of workers themselves. While I speak, I'd like you to bear in mind the possibility that Ignatius Sancho was right in 1778 and is still right today. The drivers for the existence of slavery are international commerce and money, money, money. So what is forced labour? The International Labour Organization, the ILO, sets out 6 indicators of forced labour, the visible signs of a hidden exploitation. The first is threats of actual physical or sexual violence. The second, restriction of movement and confinement to the workplace or a limited area. The third is debt bondage. The fourth is withholding wages, including excessive pay deductions. The fifth, retention of passports and identity documents. And the sixth, the threat of denunciation to the authorities. Now, this stands in stark contrast to the idea of decent work, defined as productive and secure, providing adequate income, offering social protections, respecting labour rights and unions, and offering dialogue and participation for workers. The best way to think about forced labour, then, is to imagine a continuum between those two poles, running from decent work through poor quality work to illegal working practices and ending with the extreme exploitation amounting to forced labour. People move in and out of forced labour as time passes. They move along that continuum between forced labour and decent work. Acquiring new skills, particularly English language skills, can lift workers out of forced labour and into better quality jobs. For some, this improvement in working conditions is permanent, while others remain vulnerable to slipping back into forced labour. You can see this very clearly in our research on the experience of forced labour amongst Chinese migrant workers, including the story of Xiao Sao, who came to the UK and worked in a succession of jobs, each with slightly better paying conditions, only to then become unemployed because of his immigration status and left vulnerable to extreme exploitation all over again. He said, "When I was living in London, one room was shared by 5 to 6 people. We slept in mattresses. Later, when I worked in Manchester, the employer provided us with accommodation, and one room was shared with 2 people. But I became jobless recently because they're arresting illegal workers more frequently." This blurred boundary between forced labour and less severe exploitative labour practices means that identifying forced labour is challenging and securing convictions even more so. In particular, for juries and for members of the public, first accepting the existence of forced labour in the UK and then understanding the profound impact of psychological rather than physical coercion can be difficult. Whatever the challenges of identifying forced labour, it is clear from JRF's research, as well as from the work of groups such as Anti-Slavery International and the TUC, that forced labour exists here in the UK, however much we might wish to turn our faces from that fact. I'll tell you the story now of Vladis, a Latvian farm worker. Vladis was employed in a chicken factory from May to December 2008 and was registered under the Workers' Registration Scheme. In January, he moved to a new job on a farm. He was aware he had to re-register, and he gave all his paperwork to a co-worker who spoke Russian and English and who assured him the registration would be taken care of. He never received a contract or pay slips, but was paid £70 a week and told the remaining salary was being put in a bank account for him. In October 2009, Vladis was in an accident involving chemicals. His employer dropped him off at a hospital and had no further contact with him. He lost his sight and had to remain in hospital for a lengthy period of time. It emerged he'd not been re-registered when he changed jobs and therefore was not entitled to support. He had no money as the supposed bank account didn't exist, and he had no source of income. Using the indicators of forced labour as a starting point and drawing on the JRF research studies, it is possible to paint a picture, however partial, of the nature of forced labour in the UK and the lives and the experiences of the workers. I'm going to group some of the experience into four main areas. The first around the idea of coercion, the second around the idea of underpaying and what's called debt bondage, the third around isolation, and the fourth working conditions. So the idea of coercion, or a lack of freedom, is absolutely central to the definition of forced labour. The ILO indicators in their shortest form identify threats of physical or sexual violence as an important evidence of this. To date, our research has uncovered relatively few incidents where workers have experienced direct violence or the threat of violence, though this is likely to be a consequence of the kinds of sectors our research has focused on. Hidden work, such as domestic servitude, and work in illegal businesses, such as cannabis farms, may well be more associated with physical abuse, and some evidence of this can be found in our study of Chinese migrants, where women experience sexual exploitation, and both men and women selling illegal DVDs were victimised. An example is in the story of Ah Ying. She was smuggled to the UK by snakeheads. These are Chinese criminal gangs from Fujian province. When she arrived in the UK, she was coerced into sex work through debt bondage. After being raped by a member of the gang, she became pregnant and, no longer of use, was dumped on the street and told that if she said anything to the authorities, her unborn baby would be hurt. For most workers in our studies, threats and coercion were of a more subtle variety. The most powerful threat for some workers, and an indicator of forced labour in its own right, was the threat of denunciation to the authorities. Now, it's important to say that the vast majority of workers identified in our research are living and working in the UK legally. However, for workers with irregular immigration status, the fear of being deported was enough to make them tolerate the most extreme exploitation. And there is some evidence that employers use the existence of civil penalties for businesses as an excuse to exploit workers still further. Here's the voice of someone in our report on food industry. He said, "In fact, this crackdown has become the employer's good weapon. When the crackdown intensifies, the employers would say, 'Look, we're employing you even at bad, dangerous times, so we can't pay you as much.' If they used to pay you 200, they would be paying you 150 now. They would say, 'I have to take risks for employing you.' They carry on exploiting economically and mentally." In many cases, a worker's immigration status is tied to a specific job. This is true of migrant domestic workers, of A2 nationals who come to the UK under the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, of A8 nationals who came to the UK under the Workers' Registration Scheme, which has now ended, and of fishermen on transit visas associated with specific boats. In all of these cases, leaving the exploitative workplace means potentially losing the right to remain in the UK, or staying in the UK and working illegally, exposed to further exploitation as well as deportation. Some employers used workers' confusion about their immigration status and threatened people who were legally resident in the UK with denunciation to authorities as a way of controlling them. Retaining identity documents, another of the indicators of forced labour, was also common, with some employers confiscating passports at point of employment or holding on to registration documents and then using this as a way of coercing their workers to stay. It's worth noting in this context that whilst concentrated in migrant communities, forced labour is not confined to them. Arrests in the recent Operation Netwing in Bedfordshire are the most recent in a series of cases where it's been alleged that homeless and highly vulnerable UK nationals have been drawn into forced labour. So immigration status may make people more vulnerable to forced labour, but it's by no means the only thing capable of leaving people exposed to this level of exploitation. Overall, the picture of employment for these workers is one of degradation and psychological abuse, where threats, humiliation, bullying, sexual harassment and racism are commonplace. This is a quote from an EU worker in a food factory. He said, "Supervisors were treating us very badly. They shouted at us, sworn at us. They did not call us by our names. We were called by numbers. They treated us like slaves, It was very difficult to get used to this. We were treated like livestock." The threat of dismissal, like the threat of denunciation, also exerts a powerful level of control over impoverished workers. Across all of our studies, we saw evidence that workers were routinely told they were expendable and that if they failed to work fast enough, or got pregnant, or fell ill, or needed time to take time off to care for their families, they'd be dismissed. Here's a Chinese woman who was working in the factories. You're not allowed to be sick. I got asthma in factory and I needed to go to a doctor, but the boss said that if you're sick so long, just get back home. We also saw evidence that where more confident workers complained either about their treatment or tried to stand by their colleagues or join unions, they were threatened with dismissal or dismissed. Jose, one of Gregorio's Filipino co-workers in the restaurant, was diagnosed with cancer. Initially, the owner accommodated Jose's treatment and need for time off, but after a while he refused to pay any more statutory sick pay, even though Jose had not used his full entitlement. Gregorio tried to persuade the employer to pay the sick pay, but without success. The employer said Jose was already sick before he came to Northern Ireland and was in breach of his contract. Shortly after this, Gregorio's employer told him he was not focused on his work and was not needed anymore. Gregorio had worked at the restaurant for 2.5 years at this stage. And secondly, I want to talk a bit about pay and debt bondage, which is one of the other major areas of exploitation we saw. So the first thing to say is that, unsurprisingly, the lives of the workers in our studies are characterised by extreme poverty. Underpayment and excessive deductions from wages were very, very common, and employer practices ranged from setting hourly rates that were well below the national minimum wage to piecework in the agriculture industry, where the already low wages fluctuated according to the prices of produce. So the first quote is from somebody picking mushrooms, and the second quote is from a Roma newspaper seller. The first man said, "There is no specific wages. It depends on how much you pick. You can get £7 or £8 an hour for bigger mushrooms, but £3 for smaller ones. Then you have to spend the time cleaning, for which you don't get paid." The newspaper seller said, "We get about 80 pence an hour, but we have to stay on the streets until 6 or 7 o'clock at night. You can get £10 to £12. Today I only make £3. Researchers even found some examples of people being dismissed to avoid the employer paying them at all. My manager one day called me and said he was dismissing me. At that point, the money had not even been paid into my bank. Debt bondage, another indicator of forced labour, was also very, very common amongst the workers in our studies. In some cases, this was a direct form of debt bondage. This is where workers would pay a sum for their passage to the UK, sometimes supplemented by agency fees for finding work, and then were made to work to offset those fees. Now, the fees can be extortionate, particularly where the worker in question is smuggled into the UK as an irregular migrant. The fees charged by travel facilitators in the Chinese worker study range from 100,000 to 300,000 renminbi, which is around 9,500 to just under £29,000. Amongst the Chinese workers, families paid off the facilitators, so the debt was owed to them, and technically that means it isn't considered to be debt bondage. However, the strong cultural imperatives in the community mean that that debt is as binding, if not more so, than debt owed to a third party. And workers in the study were determined to not only pay off debts to their family, but to send extra money home. This is a family man talking. After I paid the debts, I was relaxed. I wanted my family to have a better life, as my parents had suffered from a hard life. They had suffered a lot mentally. I can only earn money here to compensate them. I still send money back. Many employers took significant deductions from their employees' wages for transport, for accommodation, for administration. In some cases, these deductions left the workers with no pay at all. This is a woman speaking who was working in a farm. For all the work during the busy time, I've received about £119 only. Almost 2 weeks without a day off, 11.5 hours a day. Then when it was quieter, I've not received anything. I only got a pay slip with all the deductions. I wasn't even earning enough to pay for the accommodation. We also found evidence of people being deliberately kept in poverty through underemployment, where agencies required workers to sit by the telephone and be permanently available. In these cases, not only were the agents and gangmasters giving themselves a hyper-flexible workforce, they were also making a direct profit from the fees they charged them for the accommodation or from finding jobs. So the third area I'd like to talk a bit about in terms of worker experience is isolation, because one of the most important factors that rendered people vulnerable to falling into forced labour was the isolation that comes with a lack of language skills. Without at least some English, workers had no way of understanding their rights or even the information in their own pay slips for those that were being given them. And they were sometimes dependent on the exploiters to translate for them. With little money, less time and poor English, workers had no real opportunities to establish relationships in the wider community, so no one to help them understand their situation or support them to escape it. For some, contact with the wider host community was actively negative and characterised by racism and prejudice. This was particularly true for the Roma in our Northern Ireland study. This is a father of 2 children talking about their experience of living in a community. They pass by and they hit the windows. They're knocking continuously at the back of the house and they're shouting at us to get out of the house. And we don't know what to expect. There's nowhere else we can go. Our studies didn't find any examples of workers being deliberately confined to their workplace or imprisoned, but they did find some evidence that employers exploited the fears of their workers and the physical isolation of the workplace to create a similar level of restriction. And the clearest example of that can be found in Paula's story. Paula came to the Republic of Ireland from Brazil and found work in a meatpacking factory. She was moved from that first factory to a second one in Northern Ireland without understanding that she'd crossed a border and was in a new country. Her employer told all his workers that Newry was very dangerous and that they weren't safe if people saw them walking to work and that they shouldn't be seen in groups. As a consequence, for the 15 months she worked at his factory, Paula barely left her house. So finally, the working conditions and living conditions of most of the workers in our research were appalling. Workers in the studies were on their feet for as much as 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, without breaks, without holidays. Hours vary, but I was doing an average of 75 hours a week. I would start at 7 a.m. and then work till at least 6 p.m, 8 p.m, 9 p.m. There were no set times for breaks. You'd get lunch when you could, with someone covering until you got straight back to work. The work people were asked to do was often back-breaking, but also unsafe. Person hit his head, he needed stitches. He wanted to go to the doctor, but the manager told him to get back to work. Workers in the studies lived in overcrowded and poor quality accommodation. We rented a house ourselves. Upstairs there were more than 10 people, 4 to 6 people per room. Some slept on bunk beds, some lying in rows on mattresses. It cost us £19 each. So, why is this happening? I began this evening by quoting Ignatius Sancho's analysis of drivers of slavery in the 18th century and his idea that it was the nature of commerce and the desire to make money divorced from finer moral sentiments that was causing slavery to exist and to flourish. In 2007, the ILO estimated that $8.1 billion in illegal profit was being generated by the use of forced labour each year. More recently, in their 2009 report, The Costs of Coercion, they estimated the cost to the workers through fees, deductions and underpayment of wages at $21 billion each year. So there it is, money, money, money. Profiting from forced labour in this way is a relatively new market. Forced labour as a criminal offence has its roots in exploitation by the state rather than individual businesses. But over recent years, the ILO and others have seen a significant shift away from this norm and towards first an increased prevalence of forced labour amongst private businesses in the developing world, and more recently, a shift into the supply chains of mainstream businesses in the developed world. Now, one way of understanding this is to see it as part of the wider impact of globalisation. Globalisation transforming the labour market in forced labour, just as it's transforming the global labour market as a whole. Since World War II, as the flow of information, goods and people has accelerated and trade barriers have reduced, massive global businesses have emerged with increasingly complex supply chains. In some sectors, such as the food industry, this enables transnational corporations to contract out their production and then exert significant downward pressure through their supply chains. Now, in practice, this means that producers are under great pressure to reduce costs, and this, in turn, increases the likelihood that they will resort to unscrupulous gangmasters and agents to find cheap staff to pick and pack their produce. This creates a demand for forced labour. By way of example, over recent years, the supply chain practices of the major supermarkets have been subject to sustained criticism for precisely these reasons. We've all become accustomed to a steady stream of media stories about supermarkets pressuring UK farmers to reduce costs to the point that their businesses become unsustainable. Another impact of these complex, vertically disaggregated business models is that even where companies want to ensure that there is no forced labour in their supply chain, they may struggle to achieve that in practice. Between the person picking mushrooms and the international supermarket's category manager are several discrete organisations and no lines of direct communication. And at the same time, globalisation has had a long-run effect of hollowing out the UK labour market, leaving an hourglass-shaped income distribution characterised by a few high-pay, high-skill jobs at one end and a large number of low-pay, low-skilled, low-quality jobs at the other. Across former industrial regions of the UK, skilled manual work, along with the jobs that paid a family wage, have all but disappeared, leading to a steady rise in in-work poverty and a race to the bottom in conditions at the bottom of our labour market. These poor quality jobs are concentrated in particular sectors, and it is the least regulated or the most difficult to regulate of these sectors that forced labour is prevalent in. Now, based on the evidence to date, it's clear that forced labour in the UK is concentrated in sectors such as construction, caring, domestic work, hospitality, cleaning and agriculture. All of these sectors employ large numbers of people on low pay and short-term or agency contracts, and most are examples of what are called 3D jobs: dirty, difficult, dangerous. The relationship between these types of jobs and migrant labour is complex and politically contested, not least because of the long-running public debate about whether migration depresses wages or displaces domestic labour supply. Now, while the evidence is mixed about the impact of migration on pay, there is no evidence that migration displaces UK workers from the labour market. This said, we found evidence in our studies that where workers were being pressed into forced labour, they were often working alongside UK nationals who were working under far more favourable conditions. This is a factory worker speaking. I saw in the factory that local people were working alongside us, and their pace of work and their efficiency are all different from us. They worked as if they enjoyed it. They worked and played at the same time. We weren't like that at all. We never had a minute of rest. We were rushing all the time. If we imitate the English workers and had a cup of tea during work, we'd get told off. The English workers made 100 items per hour. I made 500 in the same time. It's also important to note that there is particular evidence of forced labour in the ethnic catering sector, as illustrated in our study of Chinese migrant workers. Although these businesses are not subject to the same pressures as producers in a global supply chain, there is an expectation of very long and unsocial hours, as well as of low pay, and owners are often recruiting new migrants, including irregular migrants, under conditions that for some are exploitative and for a minority constitute forced labour. Now, in addition to having a large number of low-pay, low-skilled jobs concentrated in these sectors, the UK's commitment to maintaining what's called a flexible labour market is also relatively unusual when seen alongside other European countries. In fact, here in the UK, we have, in relative terms, the highest level of agency working in Europe, concentrated in sectors where subcontracting is the norm, such as agriculture, food processing, hospitality, and care work. You probably recognise the list of sectors. It bears a striking resemblance to the list of sectors where we know forced labour to be prevalent. In our studies, we found substantial evidence that agencies or intermediaries were operating on a range of business models, all dependent on forced labour to a greater or a lesser degree. At one end of the spectrum, the snakeheads, gangs which operate in a range of global criminal businesses, are charging huge sums of money to smuggle Chinese migrants into the country. Other business models involved agents and gangmasters charging finder's fees for jobs, often along with fees for travel and accommodation, and deliberate underemployment, combining at times to create what are called zero-wage jobs. So these are the business models of forced labour, and they're supplying cheap labour into mainstream companies. Although there are a range of protections in UK law for employees, accessing knowledge about rights and entitlements and getting support for enforcing labour rights can be very challenging in practice. Over recent years, membership of trade unions has been concentrated amongst the professional public sector workforce. It's also a membership that's very focused on UK nationals. For forced labourers, mostly foreign nationals doing low-paid, unskilled work in private businesses, the likelihood of being able to join a union or get help from a union is slim indeed. And finally, there is the supply side of the global labour market, where the relative ease of international travel combines with vast inequality in incomes between wealthier and poorer nations to create a situation where many people are prepared to make very long, expensive journeys just to do exploitative work. This story of suffering, migration and hardship in order to achieve a better life for yourself and your family is an old one and is woven throughout our study on Chinese migrants. In contrast to older waves of migration from China, most of the workers in our study come from rural or semi-rural areas where people are surviving on well below subsistence incomes. This worker says, in Fuqing, a worker's salary was the second lowest in China, only about 100 renminbi, that's about £10 a month. But in the UK, I could earn about 10,000 renminbi per month. I had only one choice, which was to work abroad. One of the most problematic issues in the study of forced labour stems from the nature of this choice. For some workers, the pay and working conditions of forced labour in the UK are better than the pay and conditions available in their country of origin. Not only does this mean they're unlikely to see themselves as being exploited and hence are less likely to seek help, it also means that some commentators have raised the idea that people might choose to be exploited. I think Guy Standing's notion of a global precariat is useful here. It's not the least clumsy phrase I've ever come across, but it's an interesting idea. In his book, he distinguishes between the idea of a precariat, a large global workforce living lives characterised by social and economic insecurity, and a smaller salariat, a secure, economically and socially privileged minority. People who experience forced labour are part of this precariat. Their choices, when they make them, are only between different types of insecurity and poverty. So what can be done? If the increasing prevalence of forced labour in private businesses is indeed a function of globalisation, then any answer to the question that I give about what shall be done will inevitably sound glib and insufficient. Today, as politicians across Europe struggle with recession, stagnation, currency collapse, worklessness, inflation, the question of how we can build sustainable local labour markets that offer decent work seems harder than ever to answer. But the solution for the worker experiencing forced labour is also the solution for the low-income worker or the worker trapped in a low-pay, no-pay cycle. We need an approach to growth that moves us away from our hourglass economy and towards better quality jobs, not just more jobs. Legislation, regulation, enforcement, these all have an important part to play. and we've seen significant moves towards a more effective system in recent years. For instance, until recently, there was no criminal offence that specifically addressed forced labour in the UK, so prosecutions had to be based on anti-trafficking legislation. In 2009, the government created a new criminal offence at Section 71 of the Coroners and Justice Act, which makes it illegal to hold someone in slavery or servitude or require them to perform forced or compulsory labour. Unlike the trafficking legislation, this new offence would cover the vast majority of cases we uncovered as part of our research. However, it's important to remember that investigations in this field have mostly been very expensive multi-agency affairs and convictions very hard to secure. Across our work, and in the anti-slavery and labour rights field as a whole, there is a consensus that the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, set up in part in response to the Morecambe Bay tragedy, has done an excellent job of regulation and enforcement of the sectors it covers. These are the agriculture, forestry, horticulture, shellfish picking, food processing and packaging sectors. In fact, there is strong anecdotal evidence that the quality of the GLA's work has displaced exploitative gangmasters into unregulated sectors. This alone is a persuasive argument to expand its remit. However, part of the challenge of using regulation to reduce the incidence of forced labour practices is the extremely broad range of ways in which they break the law and the equally broad range of agencies responsible for addressing these breaches. Local health and safety officers, HMRC, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, and of course the police are just some of the organisations involved in the regulation and enforcement in this field. Working towards a system where information is shared and collated across these agencies would at least begin to build a better understanding of forced labour in the UK and would help ensure that fewer workers are left without protection. While it appears that the majority of workers experiencing forced labour are legally resident in the UK, it is clear from our research that immigration status can increase vulnerability to forced labour. A simpler system for migrants entering the UK to work would reduce this risk, as would ending the practice of linking visas to specific jobs. For irregular migrants who are trapped in forced labour, a temporary status or bridging visa that supported people to come forward and seek help along the lines of the kinds of visas available for victims of trafficking, and changing the rules for employment tribunals to allow irregular migrants to make claims would both reduce the level of protection we are currently giving exploitative employers. Raising awareness of forced labour amongst mainstream advice and support organisations, whether the Citizens Advice Bureau or local public services, could help reduce the isolation of workers and to support them to seek redress. In particular, extending the excellent work done by the TUC on vulnerable workers to make sure that local union representatives are actively looking for workers at risk of forced labour could make a real difference. Despite the challenge of managing complex supply chains, businesses can and must take a lead role in eradicating forced labour. Recent developments in corporate social responsibility, as well as a concern to protect brand, have both contributed to a much more active approach to eradicating forced labour from supply chains. The work of the Ethical Trading Initiative has been key in supporting this, as it brings together companies, trade unions and voluntary organisations to improve conditions for workers on a global scale. However, more focus on workers in the UK would be welcome, and there is a need to maintain an emphasis on workers' rights and social sustainability that's equal to the focus on an environmental sustainability agenda. Finally, we too have a part to play. We can support organisations such as Anti-Slavery International, which has been working towards the abolition of slavery globally for more than 170 years. We can raise awareness of forced labour in our own communities, with our MPs, with local business groups, and even amongst our family and friends. We can consider much more carefully the choices we make about what we buy and where it comes from. And we can play a positive role in the wider public conversation about the future of our economy. Ignatius Sancho, though clear about the relationship between commerce and slavery, was equally clear that business could be a force for good. He said, "Commerce was meant by the goodness of the deity to diffuse the various goods of the earth into every part. Commerce attended with strict honesty and with religion for its companion would be a blessing to every shore it touched at." In the current economic climate, a conversation about what our economy could be like, how businesses and commerce might be shaped for good, is happening all around us. We can be part of that conversation, and we can help make sure that the most vulnerable workers in the UK are not pushed aside and are not blamed for their own exploitation. I began this evening with the words of a slave, and I'd like to end it with the words of a forced labourer, to remind us that while much has changed since the days of the transatlantic slave trade, too much remains the same. She fed us all with a huge container. She put all the food in one container for us to eat. A man asked the boss, "Why are you feeding workers with that container?" And the boss said to him, "They come from mainland China. They're like pigs." Thank you.